So, yeah, what we're talking about here is smart assets and the imperative for smart assets in today's world. So, it's not moving on here. Do we know how to get it to move on the screen, or? Down button? No, it's not moving around here on the screen. I'm going to have to look at the screen, I'm afraid. So because it's not changing on here. So hopefully you can still hear me, still see me okay. One simple question, what's the perfect building? I'm going to start at a very high level before handing over to Tom, who's going to talk about some more of the detail of how we're addressing these issues. But in terms of the perfect building, well, you'd like to think we've been around since 1862 as Hoare Lea, the original design consulting engineer in the built environment. We're also part of the Tetra Tech High Performing Buildings Group, which is a global organisation. So if anybody knows what a perfect building should be, you would like to think it would be us. I'm not touching anything here. This one? Excuse this, we're going to be... Hey, it's gone back again. Sorry. Technology, always the problem.
It's crashed. Excellent.
How did you do that?
I was just tapping on this. I think this may have run out of power. Just use the thing.
Aha, right. I think we're off. Apologies about that. Technology in a technology session. So, as I was saying, the perfect building, what would it be? Well, when I think of this, it takes me back to a meeting I was in a few years ago now, where we had one of our major clients, who was a property portfolio investor, had a very large portfolio of properties, and we had 8 of their people around the table, and we started off with that question, what is the perfect building to you? And not unsurprisingly, depending on which perspective they were coming from, they all gave a very different answer. And so we know that even at a human level, what makes one building perfect for one person makes it not perfect for the next, doesn't necessarily make it perfect for the next person. So that's at a human level. But as an organisation involved in buildings and the built environment, what we also know is that from a global perspective, buildings are vitally important. We've heard all the statistics. In the UK, it's estimated buildings are responsible for 38% of global emissions. We know when you put those buildings in cities and put the infrastructure of cities around them, that's responsible for 80% of emissions. So we know that buildings, we've got to address the issue with buildings and their performance from an energy perspective and an emissions perspective. We also know that they're vitally important because buildings exist to help support sustainable societies. And without those sustainable societies, we are never going to have the capital or the experience to be able to address the emissions problem. So although they're part of the problem, buildings are an equal part of the solution to the future, the world we face ahead of us, because we know we must have a sustainable, robust economy and a society to actually build solutions on. So what greater driver have we got at the moment than the requirement for zero carbon? Net zero carbon by 2050. The other thing we know as professionals in the built environment is looking at the siloed nature of how buildings and building procurement and delivery and operation occurs. It's not going to happen like that. People need to take responsibility, and we need to take a joint responsibility and try and join up the processes, right from investors through to designers and engineers, to the people who build buildings, to the people who operate them, to the people who occupy them, if we're ever going to achieve our net zero carbon ambitions by 2050. And in that context, we know that decarbonisation of the grid is only going to get us so far. We've heard statistics about how much we need to decarbonise the total usage of buildings by, but there's only so much that can be done by relying on renewable sources of energy, nuclear sources of energy. We know we have got to deliver improvements to building performance. And that covers both new build and existing. And one of the interesting facts that you've probably all heard is that if we're going to achieve net zero carbon by 2050, then 80% of the buildings buildings that are going to be operational in 2050 already exist now. So new build is one thing. Existing build, we've absolutely got to work out how to apply these techniques that we're learning to. And in order to do that, of course, we've got to start understanding how buildings work better so that we can both optimize them in design and optimize them in use. And the point I would say about optimizing in design is, of course, that's a long life cycle. If we're talking about getting reductions quickly through buildings, like a lot of people have signed up to net zero by 2030 or 2025, it's no good working on a 3-year product life cycle and seeing how you're doing. And so what we need to also be looking at is, when we're looking at existing buildings, understanding how they're operating, ensure that that data, as part of the circular economy, the data is going back into the design of future buildings. So we're very much utilising the data for evidence-driven design, as well as optimising their performance. So in terms of the steps to net zero carbon, we have a nice clear hierarchy of assessing, understanding the baseline of operation, and then reducing, and then obviously generating on site. And then we also look at resourcing from renewable sources and then offsetting via carbon offsetting techniques. But of course, again, those latter options are really not really solutions, big solutions. Globally, they won't work. So we've absolutely got to focus on assessing the baseline and then reducing, maybe with a bit of on-site generation through solar PV or something like that. And the point we have to realise is that we need, in order to be able to reduce energy, yes, we understand the baseline, we've really got to understand where that energy is going and where the emissions are occurring. And so what we would say is that the idea of zero carbon leadership absolutely begins with experience. It begins with designers and engineers like ourselves, like other people in this room, who've been involved in designing those buildings. The evidence of experience should not be overlooked, and we need to start with that. But we need to then build on that evidence-driven insight. And for that, we need technology. We need the likes of digital twins. We need to be able to pull data out of buildings. And it's not all about technology, but technology can help. And the famous quote by Drucker, although it's variously applied to other people, you can't manage what you don't measure. So unless we've actually got a means of measuring and managing that data, it's going to be very difficult to achieve that. But of course, there is the other side, flip side of that coin, which is nothing becomes more important because you can measure it. And this is another quote. Sorry, I've lost the quote there. It just becomes more measurable. So we've got to be very focused on what we're measuring, why we're measuring it, and the use to which we're going to put it. And we have to bear in mind, of course, that delivering the net zero carbon complexity is all about understanding it. And the real problem we have here, and Claire mentioned this earlier, buildings are unique and complex. People are complex. How people use buildings are even more complex. And there's a two-way interaction between the performance of people, relying on buildings, delivering environments for productive outputs, and likewise buildings actually are impacted by how people operate them. And so we have this conundrum where we have to start thinking about balancing buildings. We've all the time got to think about the human-centric outcomes in line with the planet-conscious outcomes, because very often they're at odds with one another. And understand that we need hard evidence to support that. And a good place to start when we start thinking about digital twins and opening up data and the type of data is actually starting to think of buildings as ecosystems. They don't exist in isolation. At the fundamental level, there's the building form and the fabric. That's there to protect us from the weather. We can put heating in there. We then have the environmental systems that actually try and create the right internal environments. And then, of course, there's people in them, and they have the facilities and the tools of their trade that they're using. So all of those things need to operate in harmony, and we need to get the balance right between them. And they're not just buildings as ecosystems, but buildings exist as communities. They exist in an external environment. They have incoming utilities and resources. They have outgoing waste emissions and the product of whatever that building might be, whether that's people relaxed at home or people coming out better from hospitals or financial services information coming out of workplaces. And then, of course, they feed into the wider economy. So all of these things we need to take into account when we're actually beginning to pull together the data. And because of this, evidence absolutely is everything. The right sort of evidence, robust evidence, and it relies on fit-for-purpose data. So we've got to think about what evidence are we trying to produce to help deliver our net zero carbon ambitions, and how are buildings delivering on a human level. And then it's also been said previously, we need to have targeted actions that have tangible outcomes that we can measure and make sure we're heading in the right direction. So it's all about making sure we get the structure right and the robust evidence in the first place. And I'm going to show you a video. Hopefully it will work next for 90 seconds when I'll hand over to Tom for the next part of the call. But this is all about a BIM alone won't necessarily cut it because of the problem of the isolated and the siloed data sources.
Most of us now know that insight-led engagement with buildings is fundamental. By knowing what can be optimized, we can be instrumental in the global challenge for better health and well-being and a zero-carbon built environment. But how do we begin to build that insight? Consider every instrument that makes up an orchestra, each a complex piece of engineering, of craftsmanship. It can play its part in a single brief sound that's harmonious and executed to perfection. But that perfection is hard to come by. It needs every instrument responding to one another, reacting to a conductor who sees the whole picture, someone who expertly holds the entire orchestra in their hands. For too long, data in buildings has struggled to be harmonious. And if it's not inaccessible, it's most often in chaos. Conflicting requirements, contradictory systems, and technology products that fall at the first hurdle have created a cacophony of complexity. The data needed to be able to understand our buildings might come from many different sources, but it needs people who understand how it works together. This data is crying out for a conductor who can not only access the individual instruments, but see how they can come together to be more than the sum of their parts. And most importantly, they must understand the people behind the instruments, humans who think, feel, and bring their own unique viewpoints to bear. Solving these problems, this conductorless data, can only be done when technical know-how goes hand in hand with trust. This is the step towards true harmonious insight, allowing us to refine buildings to be the best they can be, for the people in them and the planet around them.
Afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to pick up where Andrew left off there and really reflect on the fact that so much of that capability that we're looking for in a digital twin, in the way that we operate our buildings once they're completed, is limited often by the state of our design models, of our design data. And I dare say, despite not professing to be a BIM expert, I've only been in the industry a couple of years now, but just looking in from the outside, I'm not sure that BIM and the current approach we've had has necessarily cut it. I think it's moving in the right direction. But BIM might not be, in its current form, really the answer that we're looking for. What we need is something fundamental, much more fundamental. And so I'm going to take us a step back to the design side. Just quickly, so my role as digital director at Hoare Lea is largely focused on producing tools, training, ways of working, innovations to support better new building design primarily, although we do a lot of renovation and refit as well, and some of those same tools are applied there. So my focus is on ensuring that we as Hoare Lea are designing better buildings fundamentally against that big picture goal of delivering net zero carbon buildings, but also buildings that perform for the people that use them as well. And so fundamentally, where we're heading as a business, and what I want to talk through now, is how this net zero impetus, what it's demanding of us, is to become data-led, and in a much more meaningful way, I think, than perhaps where we've got to so far. So what does net zero demand of us, particularly from the lens of a designer or an engineer? We need to become, as an industry, We need to be designers and engineers who can demonstrate outcomes to the client. And we see a lot of this discussion at the moment around being able to simply make a claim, state that we can provide a net zero outcome, to actually showing through data, through evidence, that we can genuinely get you there as a client. So there's a real shift going on because we are going to have to be able to demonstrate that in a much more meaningful way. So how do we achieve that? And this is something we're going through internally as a firm a lot at the moment, which is around shifting from that historic transactional approach. So whether we're talking about contracts or we're talking about design information, we've got the same slightly old school mindset, which is about transactions, it's about files, it's about import and export of outcomes, shall we say, and actually move to a much broader approach in terms of what we need to do. So, for example, here at Hoare Lea, we want to take a much more end-to-end focus. Now, that doesn't mean we want to take on the contractual responsibility for the whole supply chain. Why would we want to do that? But there's almost a mindset indication here around becoming truly, accountable, fundamentally feeling responsible for that big picture outcome that a building and a client is after. So we need to take much more interest, fundamentally, in everything from that early stage planning and design right through to operational delivery, regardless of what team you're in. So this is not about a business necessarily doing more purely in the post-occupancy space, but it's about having design teams who are fundamentally interested in every stage of the building life cycle. So what does that mean? It means that we're delivering ever more complex outcomes. The need to demonstrate that a building operates in a net zero carbon way, whilst keeping people happy and making sure that the building, for whatever its purpose is designed, is truly meeting that need for its occupants. That's really complex, and no more complex than it's ever been. It needs to be driven by data, by evidence. I think I've heard lots of mention today already, this sort of allusion to a lot of the standards that we still use in this industry that are driven from the 1970s, 1980s. The really harsh reality is that if we want to build a building to the current standards, it won't achieve net zero in all likelihood. They're incompatible. So we need to look differently, and we need to be driven by data rather than purely by standards. Or perhaps we need standards that are increasingly driven by data. And I quite like this phrase, we need to move from a copy-paste culture, and I see this everywhere. And I have to say, actually, having come from different industries, the thing that's really surprised me is we still work with files and shared drives and importing and exporting and changing formats, and so much time is lost through that process. We need to be actually moving our people towards systems thinking. So we talk a lot about automation in the industry, and I think that can often feel a bit like the cart before the horse. Let's make the existing ideas we have about how a building should be designed quicker and easier by just automating the things in the way that we currently do them. Instead, we need to move our people to a place where they are constantly thinking about the big picture outcomes. They're looking at system design strategy, and they're not constantly in the detailed design of the exact size of a pipe or whatever it might be. We need systems that can enable our engineers, our designers to stay at that much higher level for more of the time. So if I summarize it, just in a slightly different way, I guess the challenge is we need to move to an evidence base in our design. As an industry, as Hoare Lea, as others in the room, I would say. Our response to that is we need end-to-end data. And again, we talk about common data environments till the cows come home. We talk about digital twins. We talk a little bit about how they need to be connected, but really the interconnectivity is the only thing that's going to unlock all of this capability that we need out of our buildings. But what it's going to take, we keep talking about tools. It's not about tools primarily. It's actually about mindset. So it's about our characteristics as people, as teams, as businesses. It's about our actual capabilities. And when we talk about technical capability, engineering prowess, however you might want to describe it, those things are starting to look different. They're changing shape in this industry. Again, we've heard it today already. I'm doing a lot of repetition of what other people have said today. It's the benefit of being at the end of the day, I guess. But crucially, this is really about shifting people's mindsets towards being much more big picture focused, much more agile and adaptive, creative, able to solve problems in new ways, to not be afraid to try new things on new projects continually. And that's really that's the core area that we're looking at as a firm at the moment. I just want to go back to this as my bugbear, because having worked in the financial technology sector, having worked more recently in renewable energy, which has all sorts of issues as well around this, is really sort of pressing issue here, which is that we deal in files, we deal in quite an old school way of thinking about data, actually. We keep putting wrappers around it in the form of turning them into files rather than having core data. And you end up putting these roadblocks in the way. So, if you think all the way through the stages of design, so often we end up finding that we're throwing an old model into the bin because it served a specific purpose. It had no relational data, no joined up thinking behind it, and so effectively it needs to be replaced by a more detailed design for a different purpose. And then you see the same blockers therefore happening. As an example for us is, just between the different disciplines, we end up with different ways of describing systems, different file formats, depending on whether you're a sustainability engineer, or you're an MEP engineer, or working in a completely different specialism. And so we're constantly dealing with these barriers that we've created for ourselves by having discipline-focused teams rather than outcome-focused teams. And so that's another big piece that we're working on, is moving our business to orientate it around project delivery from that holistic perspective, that end-to-end perspective. Because without it, we already know that the sort of cubicle-based, siloed-based approach to working is old school. Like, we don't do this anymore, by and large. I mean, the introvert in me misses it slightly, but we've moved on from this in other respects. But actually, our approach to data in this industry has looked like this still. And of course, that just that will lead you into endless problems. We're creating hurdles for ourselves. We're standing in the way of really efficient, effective, joined-up delivery. And it's costly. It's really expensive in the form of these inefficiencies. I'm going to add one to this, which is that we may have things like poorly coordinated processes, which reduce the time spent actually on doing the important high-value things that we as humans do. But I want to add that ultimately any design output that we produce through this methodology needs complete rethinking if it's going to serve as the basis for a digital twin. You have to cut the cord and start again once more if you build in this way. So I think on some level, this is where BIM, I know we're moving it forward. It's not a fixed thing, but BIM in its current state still, I would say, doesn't do enough to really drive us forward. It still thinks in a slightly old school way, and a lot of what I've heard has been around how we add more technology, more data-driven capability to the systems and approaches and methods that we have now, rather than using new technologies to actually rethink the way that we deliver entirely. And it also, BIM does a lot to keep focus on production rather than actual design. It doesn't do enough to actually help us to enable our humans, our designers, to truly think in more creative ways, and then let the tools take more care of the production, perhaps, rather than our mental focus. So that's what it's all about. Let's return to design, truly. These more complex outcomes with net zero demand us to think much more in a big picture way. They force us to think in terms of holistic systems rather than detailed design. And ultimately then, in moving to that approach, there's a virtuous circle where we're able to think more in terms of systems. We design our tool sets to work in that way. Those tool sets save us time and move us away from the mindset of detailed design and getting stuck on sizing pipes and ducts, which in turn free up our people to think more creatively again. So yeah, I think one of the key areas of this is to shift towards this systems thinking, which means thinking of our design stages as a knowledge graph. So joining up all of the inputs that we have that go into a design, keeping track of that all the way through. And this is where I think this is different from simply a common data environment. This is actually about having a real design master, a master of information. And I mentioned the word origin there. We have a product that we're building internally at the moment. It's currently just for Hoare Lea's design teams. That is a new web-based platform that replaces, ideally, over time, our reams of individual spreadsheets, our different tools being used all over the place, and instead brings everything into one place, truly. And on that note, if you've got a really well-organized knowledge graph, where you understand at its heart what the building outcome actually needs to be, and what the solution design is, and ultimately then what the systems architecture of the building looks like, you've really got so much less work to do to get that to a performance twin. You're just plugging in real-world data onto the top of that, your sensor-driven data, in theory at least, right? So again, I'm going to keep hammering the point whilst I get away with it. When building data equates to files, with this file-centric mentality, you do end up with a mess on your hands that takes a long time to get through to the outcome that you're after. I'm borrowing this from a guy in my team called Will Reynolds, who really is the mastermind behind our new Origin product. And he's been thinking about turning building data into that knowledge graph, and we've done it at a technical level now. But without doing that, this is where you end up. You import from one file format to another. You then spend at least 60% of your time actually just fixing it, getting it to a place where it works in the file format you need. You do your bit of design, and then you export it. And then when you think we want to do more collaboration, we want to work in bigger teams and do it, more of the time, isn't that fantastic? When in fact you follow with the same method, you end up repeating that process over and over, and all people end up spending their time doing is importing and exporting and fixing. It isn't better naturally without the technological improvements. So let's get our engineers, let's get our design teams focusing on what they do best. Rapid insight through data, evidence that can drive actual design, that then will serve as a new evidence base. And you can think of this at a big level in terms of project to project to project, or even just design stage to design stage. Iteration, reflection with the client, new data we might get back, feedback we might get, and then iterate more rapidly. And we need to add automation into that mix. We don't add automation, we shouldn't necessarily just add automation into the old way of working. Automation is so much more powerful when it's plugged into this method. So yeah, this is what we need to do. You need to turn these files over, shake them out, and see what's inside them, and start thinking about engineering design at any level you like. So, we could be thinking about the building, we could be thinking about the whole project as a whole, we could be even thinking higher than that. But actually, let all these objects in all of these various files and formats instead give us insight that help us design right to that basic level. So, for example, any component that might go into a design will have that metadata attached to it that makes it make sense on its own, becomes part of a system. So then, this is how we can then view systems, and this is where I'll finish off. And this is what our Origin product is driven by, which is this sense that you can have your 3D model, you can have your geometry, but rather than that geometry just being based on a ton of flat information, which could be delivered in a good old tabular spreadsheet format, we think in terms of systems. So we think in terms of nodes, connections, interconnectivity, and this then can form the basis of your performance twin further down the line. But it absolutely requires that systems thinking. So I think I'll park it there. That's what I'm saying essentially, is that this is about producing digital twin ready design, because that's what it's ultimately going to be all about if we're going to achieve those outcomes. So yeah, leave it there. Thank you.